Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8. This is Emma Weinheimer, and today I'm going to be interviewing Professor Mary Johnson on some of the works of Flannery O'Connor. Professor Johnson is a professor of English here at Mount St. Mary's University. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Professor Johnson, would you tell me a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. This is my, fifth year, finishing my fifth year teaching at the Mount. I teach mostly in the core, Symposium, America and the World, Origins in the West, and then sometimes in the English or Communications department. My background is in English composition. I've taught previously at the University of Maryland. I taught for a couple of years in a high school in Prince George's County. I made them read O'Connor, and they always had lots of feelings about her short stories, which was a lot of fun. That's kind of the point of what O'Connor is trying to do, which we can talk about later. But my husband, Brendan, also works here at the Mount. We have 3 kids, an almost 5-year-old, an almost 3-year-old, and then a third one who will be arriving later on in the summer.
Awesome. So, which works of Flannery O'Connor have you chosen to talk about today?
I picked a short story, "The Life You Save May Be Your Own," which is from, I believe, her first collection of short stories called "A Good Man Is Hard to Find," and then I have an essay of hers from a collection called "Mystery and Manners." The essay is called "The Fiction Writer and His Country," and I think it does a good job of explaining kind of her perspective and what she saw herself as trying to do in her fiction, which, for me, understanding her perspective as a writer makes her short stories make a lot more sense. They're still going to be weird, but they make a lot more sense if you have a little bit more understanding about her perspective.
Awesome. Okay, so before we get into the content of the essay and short story you've selected, could you tell me a little bit about Ms. O'Connor and give us a little bit of historical context, if you can, about just kind of like what she may have been responding to, whether in her own personal life or in the world?
Sure. She was born in 1925 in Atlanta, Georgia. She spent the majority of her life in the South, and so all of her stories are depicted in the South with Southern people because that's what she knew best. Mm-hmm. She thought that writers should depict the people and the situations that they knew the best and that were most natural to them. So she went to college in Georgia. She attended the University of Iowa's writing workshop. She lived for a short time in New York City with some friends of hers in the publishing industry. Her father died of lupus when I think O'Connor was maybe in her late teens or early 20s, and it's a disease that she was later diagnosed with. And so it caused her to not be able to travel as much. Her family moved from Atlanta to the city of Milledgeville, Georgia, which is about 2 hours outside of Atlanta. And then right before she was diagnosed with lupus, they moved from the town of Milledgeville out to a family farm. And that's where O'Connor spent the remainder of her life. She lived with lupus for about 12 years, which was about 7 longer than her doctors expected her to live. She raised over 100 peacocks and different types of exotic birds, different types of chickens and peafowl, much to the dismay of her mother. Her mother thought it was really weird. She was like, "Oh, Mary Flannery's got another crate full of chickens." And she actually, in Mystery and Manners, the book of essays, has an essay about peacocks, which is nice, just fun. And so while she was living on the family farm, she wrote the majority of her fiction. She's written two novels. The first was published in 1952 called Wise Blood. The second in 1960, The Violent Bear It Away, and then 2 collections of short stories. A Good Man Is Hard to Find, which is probably the most well-known of the 2, And then Everything That Rises Must Converge was posthumously published in 1965. O'Connor ends up dying in 1964. While she was on the farm, many people think of her as a recluse, sort of in the tradition of Emily Dickinson, where she just stayed in her house and never saw anybody ever, and just wrote all the time. And that wasn't exactly true. She enjoyed people, but she also kind of was socially awkward at the same time. But her mother, though, was a very energetic, extroverted person. So when they were living in Milledgeville, they had extended family in the area, and so her mother was always having dinner parties and social things, and would compel Flannery to attend these social things. And Flannery would be just like in the corner in a chair, sort of engaged, but mostly just observing what was going on. And so she did have a lot of social interaction. She would actually invite friends and fans of her writing to just like, if you're ever in town, come on out to the farm. And so she would just get random fans of her fiction would just come to the farm, and they would just talk and visit. So I think that balance honed her observational skills, which I think is what makes her such an incredible writer, because even though she wasn't traveling in the world, she wasn't jet setting all over the place, she wasn't living in a large city for most of her life, but she did have many opportunities to observe people and what people are actually like, how people talk to each other. And so those things inform the way that she writes dialogue, the way that she writes descriptions, and then the type of people that she sort of caricatures in her fiction. And then I would also say, in terms of my own exposure to her, I think like many people, I think A Good Man is Hard to Find, one of her best-known short stories. I read it in high school. I have absolutely no recollection of what we talked about or what I thought of it. I read both of her novels and maybe a couple short stories my freshman year of college. I also don't really remember what we talked about. I remember learning that she was Catholic, still thinking all of her stuff was really weird, but sort of being interested. I think after freshman year of college, I bought her 2 collections of short stories and read them and was just like, these are a little bit violent. The people are terrible. All the stories are weird. I don't really understand the point that she's going for here.
But you kept coming back.
But I kept coming back. And so that's a point of encouragement that I always try to make to students or other people who read O'Connor and are like, what in the world is she talking about? You have to give her a little bit of time and a couple of rereads before it starts to make sense. In my first year of graduate school, we were assigned a semester-long project to choose a text that had been revised in different ways, and we had to look at archival records of how the author revised the work and how it was received by audiences over time. And so I saw O'Connor's novel Wise Blood was on the list. So I thought, well, let's give her a third shot and see if we can make any sense out of her this time. And so I read the novel once or twice for that project, and then I read the collection of essays about her perspective on writing fiction and her perspective on faith. And that's really when all of it seemed to start to make sense. She introduced me to a lot of ideas about how to read in kind of the liberal arts tradition or the Catholic intellectual tradition that she borrows from people from like Thomas Aquinas and Jacques Maritain and all of these big thinkers in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And even earlier than that. But she helped me see that the way that she was trying to write and that a Catholic way of reading a text is she tries to depict real experiences of real people in her short stories and novels, depicting what the world is actually like in its weirdness and gruesomeness and violence sometimes, with an eye toward what people are actually like. But also, as a Christian, understanding that there is more to the world than what you can just see with your eyes and hear with your ears. That there are spiritual realities at work in the world, not just what is material and what you can see. And so that helped me read her work. It doesn't make it easier to understand. Well, it makes it easier to understand in some ways, and then it opens up more questions.
Yeah.
Like, you end up having more questions than you actually have answers to, which I think is the point of what she's trying to do.
Yeah.
That she's not looking for, here's an easy answer. And she actually says, I think either in some of her letters or one of her essays, that if an author is writing with a particular message in mind, then you'll end up having a really good message, but you'll end up having a bad story, because you're going to have to manipulate too much the characters or the events or the world of the text in order to make it fit into the message that you're trying to put across.
Yeah.
Where if you just depict reality as you see it, knowing that there is more to life than just what meets the eye, that there are spiritual realities, then, and she says this in the essay, The Fiction Writer and His Country, that being a Christian writer doesn't limit her vision, it actually expands what she is able to talk about. It doesn't limit her at all.
Okay. That's very cool.
Yeah.
So to like briefly sum up like what you're telling me, because she wrote about people, like real people that she experienced, she's talking about like how the world actually exists, but also like kind of her corner of the world. Would that be correct?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. She
Awesome.
says repeatedly in some of these essays that you write about the world that you know the best. And she says, I think in The Fiction Writer and His Country, that you write about the country that you know, and that could be the physical, like the region of the South or the region of the Northeast. Write about that country, but she says somewhere that your country also resides within yourself. So as a Christian, write about all of that stuff too. And again, not in a simplistic, I'm going to write a story about Jesus, but set it in the South with some kind of arbitrary people and arbitrary events.
Like the really bad books you see like in Walmart, like the Amish love stories, for example.
Yes. Don't do that.
Don't do that. No.
Yeah, she would say those are excellent messages, but bad stories.
Yeah.
So, and which I tried to read one of those in, I think, last summer.
Oh my gosh.
And I couldn't get more than like 5 pages into it because it was exactly that. I could see the message very clearly from the very beginning of the book. The message that the author was trying to lay out, but the characters were terrible, the events were terrible, the descriptions were terrible.
Yep.
And so I was just like, I can't.
Awesome.
This is going back to the library for someone else. It may be someone else's cup of tea, but it's not.
Glad you didn't buy your own copy.
No.
Awesome. Okay, so I am really excited to get into the content. Do you want to start with the short story or the essay?
I think maybe the essay probably will make
Okay.
the summary of the story make more sense.
Okay. Yeah, so could you give us like a brief-ish summation of what she talks about in her essay?
Sure. So the essay is called The Fiction Writer and His Country. And some of the main points, one of which is what I said a few minutes ago, that her way of writing is informed by a Catholic understanding of the world, which just means God made the world. There's evidence of God everywhere in the world that is evident to believers and non-believers at the same time. And grace which is the working of God in the world, is evident everywhere. It's available to everyone, but the acceptance of grace can be painful to us because it's so radically different from what we're expecting life to be like. She also says, and I think this is the quote, I give this quote to my symposium students when we talk about good country people, which is...
That's the one we read in the core.
It is.
Yes.
Yes. With the girl Helga with the wooden leg that gets stolen at the end.
Yes.
And
yes.
which if you I always feel kind of silly like giving the summaries of some of her stories because
They sound so arbitrary.
they sound so arbitrary and like, okay, well, why would anyone want to read this book? I mean,
Yeah.
but that's like another part of her method of writing fiction is that I always think of her stories as like experiences where she's just putting before you people and places and events that you enter into sort of like in a sacramental sort of way where you know that there is what's going on the surface and then there's some sort of spiritual reality underneath it. But at the same time, not everything in an O'Connor story is symbolic. And so I found a quote from her. It's probably from one of her letters where university students asked her to explain the significance of a certain character's hat. And her reply was, its significance is to cover his head. That's what I gave him a hat for. So his head is covered. And so
That's such a funny dig at English majors.
It is. She had very strong feelings about English majors and English teachers. There's at least one or two.
And the curtains were blue.
Yeah. So what is the significance of the curtains being
The character liked blue. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
No, and that would legitimately be her answer. Like, it doesn't matter. There are curtains to keep out the sun on the window. And so she really rejected the sorts of people using things like critical theory to try and overread meaning into her stories, where she would say, no, the meaning is the story. Just read the story.
Yeah.
And then you will understand what it means. Don't try and read on, like, map on some sort of critical Marxist theory or like any other thing that we learn as English majors to do to a piece of literature. She says in another one of her essays, like, when I think of the modern English classroom, I imagine works of fiction being laid open like a frog in a biology lab with its little organs and pieces being taken apart.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so she says, don't do that.
Yeah.
Read the text for what it is, experience it for what it is, and then the meaning will come through just actually reading the text.
Nice. Okay. Tell me about what is this essay called again?
It's The Fiction Writer and His Country.
Thank you. Yes.
And then I think the other, just the best quote. This is what I give to students before we read Good Country People.
There we go.
She says, the novelist with Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him, and his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. And he may well be forced to take ever more violent means to get his vision across to a hostile audience. When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs as you can relax a little and use more normal means of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, when it doesn't agree with you, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. And so I think you asked at the beginning, what sort of cultural issues is she responding to? And I think that is really it, that she's responding to a culture that is becoming more and more secularized. In the 1950s and 60s, less able to see, less religious, right at the beginning of things like the sexual revolution. And so less able to see God at work in the world, where someone like, another example from the core, like reading Dante and Dante's Inferno and the Divine Comedy, that was a very Catholic and Christian way of looking at the world. It wasn't a stretch. You didn't have to convince most people that this was the way that the world is, that there was a maker of the world who is good, who designed mankind to be good, and all of those things. But as we get, and then we see it especially now, where before you can even have a conversation that is trying to evangelize someone and tell them about the love of God, for example, there are so many questions that you have to answer first.
Yeah.
And so if she were trying to write a nice, warm and fuzzy story about Jesus, it wouldn't, like, she knew that it wouldn't work because her audience believes so differently than she does. And so what she has to do is create these characters that are larger than life caricatures of real sorts of people. They do ridiculous things. They're incredibly mean and insensitive, many of them. There's a good deal of violence in a lot of her stories because she knows if I just try and straight up talk to someone about a sacramental view of the world, no one is going to understand what I'm talking about. So I have to, and so her characters don't understand it. She knows that her readers won't understand it. And so she knows I have to shock my readers into paying attention, just like she has to shock her characters into paying attention to the spiritual realities of the world. Then, once we do all of that, then they're open to grace and looking at the world in a different way. So yeah, I think that's the knowing that that is prevalent in her stories, and that there's always a moment, usually towards the end of each story, where there's some really violent thing that happens to one of her characters, an abrupt violent thing that allows for what she would call a moment of grace, some sort of unsettling thing that happens.
That's also the aha moment.
Sort of the aha moment, usually right at the end, and then that's where the story ends. So we don't get to see, okay, well, what does that character do next after this? It's just a grandmother gets shot by a serial killer, or a guy gets a tattoo of the Byzantine Jesus icon on his back, or other things like that. So now what happens? We don't know.
That's not the point of the story.
That's not the point of the story. But I think we don't see the next step at the end of the stories, which I think is her point.
Yeah.
I always see, or I have started to see, her short stories as kind of like an examination of conscience, because it's very easy to say, well, gosh, the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find is just insufferable, which she is. She's insufferable, and she's prejudiced, and she thinks that she's perfect. Hulga in Good Country People, also insufferable, thinks that she's smarter than everyone else, which is the point. And then in the short story that I selected, Mr. Shiflett thinks that he's kind of got everything figured out and that he's doing the right thing. But then at the end, he realizes that they've made the wrong decision, or they know that they're given an opportunity to make the right decision. And then they get smacked in the face with the moment of grace, and then that's like the end of the story. So yes, these characters are insufferable, but I think it would be too easy to just be like, well, the grandmother's terrible, this was a stupid story. What I have come to experience the more that I read her work is, oh, well, the grandmother is terrible and insufferable, and Hulga thinks that she knows everything, but so do I. So, then it hits a little bit closer to home, and you actually have to think about, oh, how am I insufferable? In what ways do I think that I know everything? In what ways do I think that I'm better than everyone else because I act a certain way? And then in what ways am I getting hit in the face with some opportunity to change? Now what am I going to do with it?
That's really interesting that you describe it this way, because like I'm finding myself thinking about the parable of the prodigal son and of like all of the various prodigals about vineyards and masters and servants, and like how many times would her audience and how many times have our audience heard these same stories over and over. So I wonder if these are like a way of, I don't want to say retelling parables, but I wonder if they function in a similar way with these similar intended shock value, because at the time that these stories were told to Jesus's immediate audiences, like those were like, whoa, what? Why would you make a character like that? That person sucks.
And also, we don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. So like the way you're describing this sounds very much like a parable. So I'm not sure what we want to do with that, or we can come back to that later, but just that's something that I'm finding myself thinking about a lot as you're talking about this.
That's true. I've never thought about them being like parables. I think there is a similarity in that the parables have kind of a stock sort of character, but like O'Connor's sort of does. I'm not sure. I mean, the one thing about parables is there's like, I'm thinking of something like Aesop's Fables or something like that, where they're more formulaic and there's a clear correlation between this character and who that character represents. Kind of like a one-to-one comparison.
That's true, yeah.
Where I think O'Connor would probably bristle at that a little bit, that you're being too reductive. But I think that could be, especially for someone who's reading her for the first time or who's coming back to her after thinking, meh, she's just too weird for me, that maybe thinking of it as a parable. Because parables, you know that there's going to be some sort of lesson.
Yes.
At the end.
And we see what each character does with their moment of grace, whereas you don't see that with O'Connor. But sometimes, I mean, like, what they do with their moment of grace is really shocking. And the fact that we don't see it with O'Connor, especially with like how much we like our stories, we like our cut and dry formulaic stories, the way that O'Connor tells hers is so shockingly different. And we don't see what happens, and that's kind of terrifying, but I digress. Anyway, okay, we keep getting really off track. Like, what exactly, like, why did she write this essay generally? Like, I think there were a couple points that you were saying that she makes, and we talked about one in the very beginning.
Yeah. I think those were the reason that she uses the grotesque or the violence is really the most important thing to point out from this essay. But she, especially before she became really ill at the end of her life, she would travel throughout the South especially, but into other regions of the country as well, and give lectures. So these essays in Mystery and Manners are, I think some of them were published, but most of them were speeches that she gave to university students, to the Georgia Ladies Society or something, like a ladies book club, where she was invited and to speak about different topics. She has a whole essay about the grotesque in Southern fiction. She was asked to respond a lot about what does it mean to be a Southern writer, in like, is she writing in the same tradition as somebody like William Faulkner or Eudora Welty or something like that. A lot about her kind of perspective on writing fiction. She has a couple of essays about how to teach fiction, which she is ruthless toward English teachers, and basically how they're all doing a bad job because they teach writing and literature in this very reductive way that's too focused on theory rather than focused on understanding the story for what it is. So it's a lot of, and that's why I think reading this essay, or this book of essays, helps so much with understanding O'Connor, because a lot of her main points are repeated several times throughout different essays. And that really helped me make more sense of what her fiction was actually talking about. But I think at the same time, the essays, I don't want to give the impression that like something magical will happen if you just read the book of essays and then you'll have the magic key that will unlock all of O'Connor's work and then you'll be able to understand everything. Maybe some people can, but that was never the case for me. I think still looking at whatever, if it's her novels or her short stories, looking at them as a piece of text that you enter into and enjoy her craft in the story, and then make meaning out of it, knowing what she wants you to get out of the story, and then sort of applying it to your own life like we just talked about. Knowing that there's some sort of shock at the end, the character will have to respond to it, and then similarly we will have to respond to it too. I think we can probably move to...
Yeah, let's go to the...
I'll give you the summary of the book, which writing it out, it just leaves out so much. Okay, so the story that I picked was The Life You Save May Be Your Own. The summary is this. There's a guy who shows up at a farm that is owned by an old woman and her deaf, probably intellectually disabled daughter. He does some work for them. He fixes an old car. The old woman convinces him to marry her daughter, He agrees, mostly because she says you can have the car too. So he agrees. They get married. They drive away for their honeymoon. They get about 100 miles away from home. He realizes he's made a mistake. And then, spoiler, he leaves her at the diner and continues on his way to the city that they were driving to.
Mm-hmm.
The end.
That's it?
That's it. That is the story.
Wow.
Yeah. So again, like, what in the world is the point? And that sounds awful.
Yeah.
What a jerk.
What did you say this main character's name is?
So the main character is Mr. Shiflett.
Okay.
And the old woman's name is Lucy Nell Crater, and then the daughter's name also is Lucy Nell Crater.
That's not confusing at all.
No. But I think this story is one that I would have my high school students read, and they always had lots of feelings about him leaving her in the diner, because she's deaf, for one thing, so she can't communicate with anyone. And she's depicted in a way that you probably know that has some sort of intellectual disability. Mm-hmm. So she can't communicate, also doesn't really understand what's going on. And then he just leaves her there. They stop to get dinner. She falls asleep on the bar at the diner. And as the barman is making up the food, Mr. Shiflett says, "Oh, just give it to her when she wakes up. I'll pay for it now." And then he leaves and continues driving. And so they were always like, how could he do that to her? What?
At least he paid for it, though.
I mean, at least he paid for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, he calls her. He says, "Oh, she's just a hitchhiker. I've got to make my way to Tuscaloosa." So he just leaves her there.
Dude.
Yeah. Dude. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then, so as he's leaving, he sees a billboard on the side of the road that says, "Drive carefully. The life you save may be your own." And so then he picks up a hitchhiker, and then he goes on to just kind of ramble and talk about how good his mother was. And then the hitchhiker jumps out of the car, leaving him to continue driving by himself. Mr. Shiflett says, "My mother was an angel of God. He took her from heaven and gave her to me, and I left her." And so he starts to cry. And then the boy says, "You go to the devil," he cried. "My old woman is a flea bag, and yours is a stinking polecat." And with that, he flung the door open and jumped out with his suitcase into a ditch.
Huh.
And so he says, Mr. Shiflett says, "My mother was an angel of God." And that is the exact same thing that the boy who's working at the restaurant says about Lucy Nell, this girl that he's married. She has long pink gold hair. She's 30 years old, but because of her disabilities, she appears to be much younger, mm-hmm. much more innocent. And so she's laying on the bar in the restaurant, and he looks at her and says, "She looks like an angel of God." And then Mr. Shiflett is like, "Oh, she's just a hitchhiker. I gotta go. Bye. Give her food when she wakes up." But then he continues, so he's driving his car toward Mobile, Alabama. And in the closing 2 paragraphs, O'Connor says, "Mr. Shiflett was so shocked about the hitchhiker jumping out of the car that for about 100 feet he drove slowly with the door still open. A cloud, the exact color of the boy's hat and shaped like a turnip, had descended over the sun, and another worse looking crouched behind the car. Mr. Shiflett felt that the rottenness of the world was about to engulf him. He raised his arm and let it fall again to his breast. 'O Lord,' he prayed, 'break forth and wash the slime from this earth.' The turnip continued slowly to descend. After a few minutes, there was a guffawing peal of thunder from behind, and fantastic raindrops like tin can tops crashed over the rear of Mr. Shiflett's car. Very quickly he stepped on the gas, and with his stump of an arm, Sticking out the window, he raced the galloping shower into Mobile. And that's the end of the book.
Oh, that's a really good ending.
Yeah. And
it's beautiful. Wow.
Yeah. And so she uses...
Okay, when you put it that way, that's a lot less abrupt. Thank you.
Yes. It's still weird.
Yeah.
But I think it prompts you to think about... O'Connor uses... A lot of her characters have some sort of physical disability in many of her stories. So people who've read Good Country People, Hulga has a fake leg. Mr. Shiflett, the main character in this story, has a stump arm. There's a disabled deaf girl. Many of her characters wear glasses. Lots of older people who can't do a lot of physical labor anymore. And so I think she chooses characters, or chooses to have characters who have these physical ailments to prompt us to think about the ways that we are maimed in some way by the bad decisions that we make, the ways that we sin, the way that the world is broken, the way that the world doesn't work the way that it should, the way that the world encourages us to make bad decisions. And it allows us to, like I've said a couple of times, like, put yourself in this story. Like, are you like Mr. Shiflett? Who are the disabled girls that you're bringing to a diner and saying that you'll marry, but then just being like, oh, this is too hard, never mind. I made a mistake. So I'm just going to leave her here and take the car and keep going. It is abrupt, and I think that's why it's so much better to read the whole thing rather than just relying, because, like, from the summary that I gave you, why would anyone want to read that? It doesn't seem like it makes any sense. It seems very abrupt, but from the descriptions that she uses, the dialogue that the characters have, you enter into the story, and so then, once you've entered into the story, the weird and violent and abrupt ending, it at least makes more sense, because you've been immersed in the whole thing the whole time. It's still weird. It's always going to be weird, but it's slightly more understandable being in it than just reading the summary and thinking, what in the world was this woman doing?
Wow, that's really, really interesting. I couldn't remember the name of the one that we read in the core curriculum, and I definitely thought you were going to pick that one, and I was slightly disappointed when you didn't, but I wanted to be surprised, and that's a really, really interesting story that you chose. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, normally in these episodes about this point, we usually start talking about, like, okay, so, what does this story suggest for, like, how to live morally, or, like, what does this say about, like, human behavior, or, like, what it means to be human or anything. But I feel like we've been kind of talking about that from the get-go. It's like all of her work is super intentionally a commentary about the world and how it works, and how, the world doesn't work as it should. And you can and should strive for that, but like, recognize where you're broken. Yes. And that there's not a clear there's no nice little bow on the end of any of her stories. Even when the resolution makes sense, it's not pretty. It's not pretty, and you don't feel good. Like, you don't feel a warm and fuzzy feeling when you get to the end of her stories. It's more just, it's a very unsettling feeling. And so it makes you have to keep thinking about it. You don't usually forget about, even if you don't remember the title of Good Country People or all of the details of what happened, you remember that there was some girl who was really cranky, and she gets her leg stolen, or her false leg stolen at the end of the story. And so you can, and that's the great thing about the core curriculum and the liberal arts, is that you can take, once you learn a little bit about history and literature and philosophy and theology, all of these other subjects, you can kind of circle back to the stuff that you read earlier in the core and add in, oh, this makes sense with what Thomas Aquinas says about the sacramentality of the world, or in philosophy and things like that. And then it helps make texts like this make sense. But I think other things that I see about living well that you can learn from O'Connor is using your gifts well. She
is an excellent writer, and she saw her writing wasn't something she just kind of stumbled into arbitrarily. Mm-mm. She recognized, and when people would ask her, why are you a writer? She would say, because I'm good at it. And it wasn't like, she wasn't being haughty or overly proud.
That's a particular kind of humility to be understanding of your own gifts.
Right. And so she said, I know this is my gift. I know I have to work at it to improve, but this is a specific thing that God has given me to do, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. Mm-hmm. And so she kind of annoyed some of her publishers by how much she would rework these stories and revise them. Part of that project that I did in graduate school was looking at her process of revising her work. And there was a book that I got from the library that it was like a catalog of every piece of paper that was in her archives at Georgia State Teachers College, I think, wherever she went to undergrad in Georgia. But she would take like small snippets of dialogue and rework them multiple times. Paragraphs that she would rework multiple times for everything that she wrote.
So if she writes like a 5-page short story, she probably has like 30-something pages of like edits.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, so thousands and thousands of pages in her archives of just things that she wrote over and over and over again. Yeah. Because she wanted to do the best. Like, she knew she had a divine gifting for being a writer. So if that's the perspective that you take, of course you would try and do it to the absolute best of your ability. And so I think that's a great encouragement to students as all of us are trying to figure out what is the work that we're called to do. Doesn't really matter if it's being a teacher or doing intellectual work or even being a parent, primarily working in your home where you're not being seen very much by other people. But what is the work that you're called to do, and how can you do it to the best of your ability? Even if you're a truck driver, not doing anything particularly intellectual or creative, how are you doing the work that you've been given to the best of your ability in a way that glorifies God?
That's really good. Wow.
Yeah, because it changes your whole perspective. Yeah, it changes your whole perspective on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then it changes what counts as being successful.
Yeah.
Where she wanted to share her work with many people, but that wasn't the primary goal for herself as being a writer. Yeah. She just wanted to be the best Flannery O'Connor that she could be, reach as many people as she could, because she thought that was important. But she wasn't becoming an author to make the New York Times bestseller list and make $1 million and be really, really famous. She was more motivated by using her gifts to glorify God, regardless of how many people ever really ended up seeing it. Yeah. And so I think knowing that about her too can help build a better appreciation of her work, because you can look at the way you can read any of her stories and know that, okay, The Life You Save May Be Your Own is maybe like 10 pages long. Every single word and every single description that is in the story is there for a reason. And it's particular, even if the curtains being blue don't have some sort of magical symbolic significance, they're still there for a reason to build the world of the story in a certain way. And so I was just thinking, I recently read a novel by Thomas Hardy. He's a British author. It was written in the mid-1800s. Wordy, long descriptions about the countryside. All of them had words that I didn't know. They're like big SAT words.
Ew, gross.
Long sentences. But then coming back and reading O'Connor, all of her, even if she has long sentences sometimes, the words that she uses are very short.
Yeah.
And so they all land, like they all punch you in the gut a little bit more in the way that like a flowery depiction of a meadow. by a British author in the 19th century doesn't land the same way with as much force. Because, again, she knows and this is not to say that Thomas Hardy didn't try very hard when he was writing his novels, but it's much leaner. And, like, if I can read you this is the first paragraph of another story, just to give an example of...
We get a bonus story.
Bonus, yeah. This is another one I was thinking about including. It's about a guy. It's called Parker's Back. Parker is in an unhappy marriage, and he likes getting tattoos. And so his whole body... Is
this the one about Byzantine Jesus?
Yes.
Okay.
And he gets the Byzantine icon of Jesus on his back.
Gotcha.
So this is the first paragraph. And what I love about her craft is that she, in one paragraph, not even a quarter of the page, she tells you exactly what two characters are like within a very short amount of time. So it goes, Parker's wife was sitting on the front porch floor snapping beans. Parker was sitting on the step some distance away watching her sullenly. She was plain. The skin on her face was thin and drawn as tight as the skin on an onion, and her eyes were gray and sharp like 2 points of 2 ice picks. Parker understood why he had married her. He couldn't have got her any other way. But he couldn't understand why he stayed with her now. She was pregnant, and pregnant women were not his favorite kind. Nevertheless, he stayed as if she had him conjured. He was puzzled and ashamed of himself. So you know, right from the start, who these two characters are, what's their relationship to each other. And then a person whose eyes are gray and sharp like ice picks, you know that this woman is not going to be like a warm, fuzzy, maternal figure.
Yes.
And so...
But she's pregnant.
And he stays with her as if she's a witch who's put a spell on him. And that's how the story starts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Like, isn't that great?
That is great.
And
it's really amazing word choice and, what is it? Syntax and juxtaposition of words. Wow.
Yeah. So all of her stories are like this. They're straight to the point, not a lot of fancy words, but they hit you in the gut.
Yeah.
Very straight to the point with the sort of people that we're talking about, the sorts of problems that they're dealing with. And so I am not a creative writer by any means, but her work is really a masterclass in how to be a creative writer or how to teach literature effectively, because there's so much to work with.
Well, we're not quite out of time, but if I could ask you if I could ask you one more question, it's a bit more general. So the grade 8, we're talking about grade books. Flannery O'Connor died in, what did you say, 1962 or something like that?
64.
Okay, 64. So she's a relatively recent addition to the Catholic intellectual tradition. So I'm sure that we have touched on this at different points, but, like, what about her and her work would you consider, like, makes either her work a great book or a great text, or has the potential to become a great book or great text?
I think some of it is what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
That it's the things that she wrote, but also perspective with which she wrote her novels and short stories. That she was writing very much in the intellectual tradition. So she was reading people like Thomas Aquinas, Henry James, who is not Catholic, but integrating his ideas, integrating Aquinas's ideas, integrating other of the great thinkers in the intellectual tradition, using them to form her own way of thinking and her own way of looking at the world, which she uses and comes through in her texts. And I think that's the benefit and the great thing about the intellectual tradition, is that everything, even from these different subject areas, philosophy, theology, history, sciences, they all kind of converge and help you understand
they all build off of each other.
They all build off of each other, and they're very different. Their perspectives are different, but you can use one to understand the other.
Yeah.
And so I think the great books are always building on great ideas. And I think that's what That's what I've come to appreciate the most about her, is her stories are great. They make you think about important things. But then a third, I think, benefit of reading O'Connor is knowing that when she was writing all of these stories, she had the intellectual tradition in her head that was helping her see the world. It informed her own faith, and then it informed the way that she's trying to, the direction that she's trying to get her reader to look in to understand the world.
Nice.
So I think it's all those things make her a great author and these great books.
Wow. Well, thank you very, very much for your perspective, Professor Johnson. It was really nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you
I'm so
for
glad
having
you
me.
could be on here.